Beer myth and misconception number 1. Beer should be served in frosted glassware. Although this is the sort of thing that's been done for many, many years and is still taking place today, it's really not a good idea. When you chill your beer down to near freezing, what you're doing is you're making it very difficult for your palate to pick up on all the flavor sensations that beer has to offer. Now, if you're drinking an inexpensive, uninteresting beer on a hot summer day, perhaps that's not such a terrible idea. However, if you're drinking a beer that you spent some good money on and it's a high quality product and there's a lot of taste sensations there to enjoy, you probably shouldn't be putting it into any kind of frosted glassware at all. Just not a good habit. Beer myth and misconception number 2. Beer is better drunk out of bottles. Not really true. This is one of those things that has persisted for many, many years, and I can only assume that it goes back to, the 1940s and 50s, and back when, when they first put beer in cans, they were steel cans. Eventually, they did progress to using aluminum cans, and my understanding is that those cans are also further lined, so the beer never really comes in contact with the can. So folks who say that beer is better out of bottles, that's really a matter of opinion, not really fact. Cans are much more protective of the beer inside. They protect it from oxidation, they protect it from light, two things that the bottle cannot do. So therefore, I contend that beer is better out of cans. Beer myth and misconception number 3. Beer should not have aftertaste. This one is, you can trace this back to advertising in the last 10 or 20 years from the big breweries who they are making beer that is not that interesting and there isn't that much to taste in their beer in the first place. So they made a marketing ploy out of the fact that their beer had no aftertaste. And what a shame that is. If you're drinking a beer that has no aftertaste, that beer probably isn't worth drinking. Imagine eating a nice broiled steak and you cut off a piece, you take a bite, you chew it, you swallow it, and boom, just like that, the flavor goes away. What a shame that would be. Same for beer. If you were drinking this wonderful beer and the minute you swallowed, the taste went away, again, what a shame. Beer is meant to have aftertaste. It should be enjoyed and savored. Beer myth and misconception number 4, and I love debunking this one. Beer causes beer bellies. Having said it just like that, there is some truth to it, but there's more to the story that you need to understand. Yes, beer can contribute to beer bellies, but so can everything else that you eat or drink. Anything that has calories, caloric content, it's going to add to your beer belly. Now, let's break it down. The one thing that's highest in calories in beer is actually the alcohol. 2/3 or so of the alcohol in beer is calories, and they're empty calories, meaning they're giving you no nutrients whatsoever. So, what other beverages have alcohol in them? Wine, cider, distilled spirits. All of the alcohol in these products also can add to your belly as well. You're drinking all that alcohol that is empty calories, that's going to go straight to your belly. So wine is just as guilty, distilled spirits are just as guilty. It's not just beer. Beer myth and misconception number 5. When you allow cold beer to get warm and then you refrigerate it again, it can cause the beer to go skunky. Now let's break that down. First, let's start with the word skunky. In the industry, the word skunky means light struck, and essentially that means that the beer has been affected by light, whether it's incandescent light or sunlight, whatever the case, and that the result will be that beer smells like a skunk. Okay, so now let's talk about the beer that was cold and went warm and got cold again. That process of cycling through the warm and cold like that multiple times, that's going to cause premature staling of the beer. It's going to go stale. It's going to become oxidized quicker over time. So yes, that process can harm the beer, but oxidation, there's no correlation between that and skunkiness. two different processes taking place here. So saying that when that happens the beer goes skunky is patently incorrect. Beer myth and misconception number 6. Beer and ale are different styles. Let's take a closer look at the two things we're talking about, beer and ale. Beer refers to any beverage that was made with the cereal grain. So what that would include would be lagers and ales and any kind of other beer styles that fall under those two classifications. So technically ale is beer, but beer is not ale. Beer myth and misconception number 7. Ales are stronger than lagers. Well, that's a wild generalization. Yes, there are ales that are more strong than lagers, but there are some lagers that can hold their own against ales. When you consider the fact that of the 100 or so beer styles that exist in the world, approximately 2/3 of those are in the ale category, the other third being in the lager category. There are several ale beer styles that have elevated alcohol content, such as barley wine, old ale, Scotch ale, imperial stout. So yes, those are high alcohol beers, but there are also some lagers that also have higher alcohol contents, such as Doppelbock and Eisbock. So just to say that one is automatically stronger than the other is not entirely correct. Beer myth and misconception number 8. Ales are darker than lagers. Again, if you understand the family tree of beers, that ales are about 2/3 of the total number of beer styles in the world, and lagers are the lesser number, about approximately 1/3. There are pale ales and there are dark ales. There are pale lagers, there are dark lagers. So to say that all ales are darker than all lagers is simply not true. Beer myth and misconception number 9. Dark beer is strong beer. Well, there are some dark beers that are indeed strong, such as Imperial Stout or Belgian Quadruple, but just because a beer is dark does not automatically mean that they are higher in alcohol. There are some pale beers that are also higher in alcohol. There is no correlation between color and alcohol. The color comes from the grain. But the more important thing that comes from the grain is the maltose, or the sugar, the grain sugar, that is eventually converted into alcohol. So it's all about the amount of maltose or grain sugar that's converted to alcohol rather than the color of the grain itself. Beer myth and misconception number 10. Bach beer is what's scraped from the bottom of the barrel once a year. So not true. Those who know a little bit about brewing know that as the beer is being processed in the brewery, it goes from vessel to vessel. It spends some time in the fermenter, but once it's done fermenting, it moves on. It's filtered and it's packaged and it goes out to the market. It's consumed. No beer is left to sit in a fermenter for any great length of time, and certainly not a year. That myth may have been started by the fact that Bach beer, traditionally speaking, historically speaking, has always been released once a year, typically in the spring. But as far as it only being released once a year from the bottom of the barrel, totally untrue. Beer myth and misconception number 11. The British like to serve their beer warm and flat. Well, in order to get to the bottom of this one, we have to realize that we have to kind of compare and contrast. What Americans are accustomed to drinking, their beers are usually served way too cold, usually about 36 to 38 degrees on tap, and beer just should not be consumed quite that cold. Comparatively speaking, the British serve their beer warmer than we Americans do, but in the spectrum of temperature, 50 degrees or so is not that cold. I'm sure you wouldn't want to bathe in water that was that cold. With regards to the beer being flat, they do have several beer styles that simply have lower volumes of CO2. They're not quite as effervescent or gassy, and they're not as biting on the palate as many American beers are. So yes, comparatively speaking, I suppose they could be viewed as being warm and flat. But if you're familiar with British beer culture, the beers are not warm and they are by no means flat. Beer myth and misconception number 12, Guinness is heavy and strong. Well, I have news for you, it's neither. I think the reason why this rumor continues to circulate and people continue to have this completely wrong concept of Guinness as a beer is because of the fact that it's dark and it's very strong tasting, let's say. Guinness does have a lot of flavor, so I think people kind of confuse the intensity of the flavor with how much alcohol is within that beer. Now, here's the thing. When you take a look at the body of Guinness versus the body of an American light lager, it's virtually similar. Likewise, if you compare the alcohol contents of Guinness to an American light lager, they're virtually identical. They're both under 5%. So Guinness is neither heavy nor strong. Beer myth and misconception number 13. All barrel-aged beer is strong. Okay, well, let's just say that most of it is, not all of it. And here's how it breaks out. Most of the beers that are brewed and put into a barrel tend to be of higher gravity and higher alcohol contents. Your imperial stouts, your barley wines, your old ales, your quadruples, beers like that already have alcohol contents of 9, 10, 11, 14%. Now, add to the fact that when beers are aged in barrels that previously contained whiskey or tequila or rum, of course those beers come out of those barrels with the flavor of those distillates, okay? So when people taste the beer, yes, they are tasting or feeling the alcohol, but they're also tasting the remaining distillate. They're tasting the whiskey, they're tasting the rum or the tequila or whatever the spirit or fortified wine was. So they automatically have this conception that, ooh, this is strong. However, brewers are also putting lower ABV beers into barrels. And so even something as light as 5, 6, 7%, if it's aged in a barrel, it's going to come out of that barrel still with the flavor of whatever distillate or fortified wine may have been in there. So there's this perception that it's a strong beer, when in fact it's not at all. Beer myth and misconception number 14. All wild beers are sour. Okay, there are not a lot of wild beers out there, but brewers are starting to expand their horizons a little bit. They're playing around with different yeasts and whatnot. Some of the beers are being labeled as wild beers. Now, there's an automatic misconception on the part of many consumers that wild beers are sour. Now, granted, many wild beers are sour, but it has to do with which wild yeasts and or bacterias may have been used to ferment or age out that beer. Some of those bacterias will sour the beer. Some of those wild yeast will not. So it's important to know which of those wild yeast and bacterias were in that beer in the first place. So you can't automatically assume that just because the beer is called wild that it's going to be sour or acidic. Beer myth and misconception number 15. All Brett beers are sour. Okay, let me break that down for you. When a beer is referred to as a Brett beer, that means that at some point in its fermentation or aging, it was introduced to something called Brettanomyces. It's a specific type of yeast considered a wild yeast. Rather than having to say Brettanomyces, they're just called Brett beers or wild beers. Brett does not automatically sour beer. It is known to produce a little bit of acid during fermentation or aging, but not enough to actually sour the beer on its own. And case in point, one of the most popular Brett beers in the world is Orval. It comes from the Orval Monastery in Belgium. It is fermented 100% with Brettanomyces, but that beer is decidedly not sour, and you can check that out for yourself. Beer myth and misconception number 16. Cider is beer. No, it's not. Never has been, never will be, and here's why. Beer is made from grain. That's where it gets its fermentable, that's its source of fermentable sugars, known as maltose. Cider, on the other hand, is made from the juice of apples, okay? So its sugar source is fructose, the same thing as wine, okay? So I have to assume that people make this mistake thinking that cider is beer, number one, because it happens to be a similar color. Apple juice looks kind of like beer, at least some beers. In addition to that, cider is also carbonated, much like beer, where wine is not always carbonated, other than champagne or sparkling wine. So there's this automatic assumption that cider is beer, when in fact it's not. Cider is actually a closer relative to wine than it is to beer.